When you come from a family with a narcissistic mother or father, things can get very confusing when it comes to knowing when you're overreacting because most toxic relationships have something called intermittent reinforcement, which essentially just means there's good times and there's bad times. And we know from studies that when there is an intermittent reward that is given, in other words, when you don't know when the good times are coming and they're really unpredictable, this generates a specific result, which is it makes people addicted to trying to seek out that reward more and more. In other words, if you have a mother or a father who is emotionally dysregulated, or even in a more calculated way alternates between treating you well and treating you badly, then what this causes in the children generally, even when they're adults, is a desire to keep sticking to that relationship in order to eventually get some of the good times back again. So I'll contextualize for this to be clear. Daniel has great times with his mom. She's hilarious, she's artistic, she likes to study, she makes great food for him, and when she's in a good mood, she's really great company. The thing is, Daniel's mom, Sarah, is very hypersensitive to criticism. She is quite emotionally dysregulated when she feels that somebody is criticizing her or pointing out any of her flaws. At these moments, she is overwhelmed by a sense of injustice. Now, it's important to understand that it's not just narcissists that can be hypersensitive. Those on the borderline spectrum, or even other people, can also be hypersensitive to criticism. In Sarah's case, she's had a very difficult life, and she feels that she carries such a great burden when it comes to all the pain that she's experienced, that she doesn't know why anyone, much less her own son Daniel, needs to mention her flaws. In her interpretation of reality, he's only doing that to shame her and make her feel bad about herself. From Daniel's standpoint, he would really love to have more of the good moments where she's in a good mood, because that's when he can be himself and he can relax. He finds, however, that because she's hypersensitive and has very explosive outbursts, he starts walking on eggshells. And this is another way of saying that he slowly dies inside in his relationship with her, because he can't really share a whole array of things about his life and his personality because he doesn't know how she's going to take it. Eventually, the relationship makes him steadily more and more ill. He feels tense, he can't trust her, and he no longer knows what his needs or values are because he finds himself always trying to adapt his personality in order to avoid triggering her emotional outbursts.
Hey guys, if you're getting any value from this video, then download your free PDF, Break the Chains, 10 Steps to Stop Your Narcissistic Parents' Control. You can find the link in the description box.
The few times that Daniel has tried to talk to Sarah, his mom, about these bad moments, she's been very punitive. She's also made him feel pretty guilty about mentioning these moments. After all, she already suffers so much. Daniel gets really confused because it is true, she had a horrible life. He doesn't want to be unfair to her. But essentially, there's no dialogue at all about these moments. And that means that over the years, they never change and Daniel just gets more and more sick. Now, this type of reinforcement can happen in all sorts of different situations. Sometimes it's just due to pure emotional dysregulation, like with many borderlines, for example, and also narcissists. Sometimes it's completely unconscious. The person doesn't actually realize that they're being unfair. They confuse feelings for facts. And when they're taken over by strong emotional reactions, that distorts their perception of what's happening. And they end up treating the person that's in front of them like maybe some abuser that they had in the past, even if the person in front of them is not being abusive at all. Sometimes intermittent reinforcement can be used in a more calculated way, specifically with people who are more actively manipulative. Some people on the psychopathy spectrum, for example. Regardless of whether there's a greater or a lesser degree of intentionality, the effect in relationships tends to be the same. It's really hard to break free from that bond because we become addicted to waiting around for the good moments. It can also happen when people use substances that alters their behavior. So maybe when somebody's sober, they act in a certain way that's more stable and nice. But when they're using the substance, then they're pretty unpredictable. It's important to understand that people who suffer from these disorders can seek help. And if they focus on their treatments, they can learn emotional regulation, or they can learn to become more adaptive in how they face the drug use. But this doesn't always happen. In Daniel's case, Sarah doesn't believe she needs therapy. A part of her personality really believes that she is the victim of the entire world and that nothing works in her life. But another part of her personality believes that she's always right, the world is wrong, and no one can really help her because she's so superior to everyone else. So in this case, the relationship doesn't really have a chance of getting any better. If you're dealing with a similar situation with one of your parents, then it's really important to understand that you might not just be overreacting and you might be feeling guilty about something, but that you're actually in the right in wanting to set boundaries. How do you figure that out when you're so confused and so guilty? Well, the first thing I say is that the thermometer for a healthy relationship is being able to have difficult conversations that actually fix problems. In unhealthy relationships, problems are never even talked about, or when they are talked about, some fight or some sort of direct or indirect aggression ensues, and the problem is never actually dealt with and resolved. This creates a situation where oftentimes people are in relationships for decades and the same problems are always getting mentioned because they're never resolved. In a healthy relationship, two people are allowed to have emotional reactions, but when talking to each other, they prefer to use nonviolent communication where they can actually see the other person's experience and come to a conclusion about how to fix the problem together. So if you're dealing with this sort of dynamic with your mom and your dad, you can ask yourself a few questions to know how to deal with the situation and to figure out whether you're overreacting, just being too sensitive, or whether it's actually something that you're in the right when it comes to you mentioning it. It's good to differentiate between things that we can let pass because they don't make anyone sick and things that really are intolerable. In any relationship, we're going to find that things aren't perfect. So if your mom or dad is kind of grumpy from time to time, but they're not overtly or covertly abusive, then maybe that's something that you can deal with just fine. However, if the way they react to you in the bad moments make you not be yourself, lose touch with your needs and values, so you no longer know who you are, and you find yourself adapting your entire behavior in order to avoid triggering the person, then that is something that's going to make you sick. It's going to make you feel dead inside, and it's going to make that relationship feel really tense and unsatisfying. The second thing is, have you tried talking to the other person in a calm, nonviolent way? Oftentimes when we deal with people who are emotionally dysregulated and hypersensitive, we've never really tried having difficult conversations with them because we're so scared of their reaction. I have found that some of the people that we're scared of are actually willing to have hard conversations with us and might even thank us if we approach them about certain subjects. But I've also found that this is really not the case with a lot of people who are on the cluster B spectrum. You'll never know if you're really confused and feel really guilty unless you try to have the conversation in a nonviolent way. If something inside you is already screaming, you know what, that's not going to happen. I tried it before, or I don't even have the mental health to try to have this conversation. And that's another important aspect to take into consideration. Maybe your mom or dad would even be open to having this type of conversation with you if it were approached in a nonviolent way, but maybe you don't even have the mental health for it anymore. If you find that this is the case, you might even be dealing with someone who wants to change, but you're so over it, you're sick and tired of it, then it might make sense for you to follow your inner compass and take care of your mental health instead. Just because somebody else does want to go through a transformation process doesn't mean you have to stick around if you're not healthy for it or not even into it anymore. Another thing you can ask yourself is if problems actually get fixed when you mention them. Do they get better and better? Or is there always some sort of reaction, maybe the silent treatment or some sort of passive aggression or even covert aggression? How does the other person react? Do they just guilt trip you or do they actually work on their behavior? A lot of adult children of narcissists feel tremendous guilt when it comes to setting boundaries with their parents. These relationships tend to be very confusing. So we don't always have clarity on what's fair and what isn't fair when it comes to what we should and shouldn't mention or what sort of boundaries we can or can't set. At the end of the day, you do have an inner compass, which is a voice at the back of your mind that's telling you when something is still worthwhile and when something isn't worthwhile anymore. If you're still confused after asking yourself all of the questions that I've just laid out here, then I invite you to just listen to that inner compass. It's not going to steer you wrong because it's really attuned to your intuition, and that is your highest intelligence. If you're not sure how to find your voice after having been raised in a narcissistic family system, then watch this video. So how do you deal with the cycles of intermittent reinforcement with your mom or your dad? Let me know in the comments.